professional development series that the student committee organizes, the purpose of it is to provide an introduction to novel topics, or to topics that are interesting within our field that not everyone is an expert in. And when we started talking about an introduction to quantitative analysis of behavior, the obvious person was Randy Grace. And not only is Randy Grace a well-known researcher in the field of quantitative analysis of behavior, currently he is the president of the Society of Quantitative Analysis of Behavior, and he has made many important contributions to the field. So we're very lucky to have Randy Grace with us today to give this introduction. Let's welcome him.
Thanks very much, Karina, and I really appreciate being invited to give a talk like this. It's actually kind of fun for me because a lot of what I'm going to say has to do with models. And I teach in a psychology department in New Zealand, and actually when I teach the undergraduate statistics course, which is required of all majors, I actually have to avoid using the word model, because anytime I use the word model, the students go, oh, like it's very, very difficult and very, very hard. And actually, my take-home message, I'll sort of spill the beans right up front. My message to you is that it's actually very easy to do quantitative analyses of behavior. There may be a perception that they're very difficult, very hard, but the powerful computer software that we have, just the way technology has transformed our field, not only in terms of data collection, but data analysis, really puts us in a position now where I think that important advances, not only for basic research and behavior analysis, but also applied behavior analysis, really are going to depend more and more on quantitative analyses. Now, I have to say at the outset that for those of you that are looking at applied behavior analysis, working in more applied areas, my background, I do basic research. I do research with pigeons on choice behavior, and so looking at response rate under VI schedules and real sort of basic stuff. And so the examples that I'm going to use are taken from that area. But the basic principles, I think, are really applicable to any research question. Well, I thought I would start, actually, with the objections that some might have to quantitative analysis of behavior. I'll just say QAB. What are some of the objections to QAB? Well, right at the, you could say what we're interested in is behavior, not math. I mean, if you have to know a lot of math to do quantitative analysis of behavior, just forget it, because we're about behavior. Might also say that B.F. Skinner has had an influence on the sort of degree of acceptance of quantitative analyses. As everybody knows, in the 1960s, he lamented the sort of fading of the influence of the cumulative record. Farewell, My Lovely was the title of an article. And Skinner really viewed with some suspicion the work of Richard Herrnstein and his students at Harvard that were developing the matching law and related research that has really evolved into the field of quantitative analysis of behavior today. There might also be a perception that QAB is associated with statistics, which are somehow bad. Skinner, of course, didn't like stats. They're based on average data rather than the behavior of individual organisms, so that presents some potential problems. And also, if you're doing hypothesis testing, there may be some potentially dubious assumptions that are involved about sampling from hypothetical populations. Now, one of the things I'm going to say today is that QAB is really not stats, that you don't have to bring these potentially questionable assumptions if you're going to do quantitative analysis of behavior. But maybe, most important thing, isn't it hard? It's really difficult to do quantitative analyses of behavior. And maybe for some researchers, there may be some reinforcement contingencies in place, not only from other researchers or from journal editors, that if an article has a lot of equations in it, it's hard, and maybe it's more likely to be accepted by a journal because the reviewers don't want to criticize it. But all of that gives an impression that quantitative analyses have to be very difficult. And as I said at the outset, that's the myth that I wanted to spell, that it's really easier than you think. So, what are some reasons for quantitative analyses of behavior? Well, numbers are really one of the most powerful tools that we have as scientists. They permit systematic observation of empirical phenomena. And the way in which numbers are applied to empirical phenomena is really the domain of measurement. And I would argue that perhaps the most salient difference between behavior analysis and mainstream psychology is that our measures are meaningful. We measure behavior. You contrast that with mainstream psychology, where we've got maybe self-report scales where you assume that you've got that the numbers are quantitatively meaningful, but whether they satisfy the assumptions of an interval scale or ratio scale is never tested, never even considered. So mainstream psychology is at risk, I think, for all sorts of problems dealing with measurement. And behavior analysis, we don't worry about that because we know what we're trying to measure. We're measuring real physical events. So meaningful measurement, if you will, distinguishes behavior analysis from mainstream psychology. Other reasons for doing quantitative analyses, well, the availability, widespread availability of modern computers and software really makes it easier. And I'll illustrate some of the techniques in today's talk. You can accomplish a lot with just a simple spreadsheet, Microsoft Excel or OpenOffice. You're able to do quite a lot. And again, I'll illustrate some of these methods. Quantitative analyses are becoming more prevalent. In an article published in JAB last year, Jim Mazur noted that there's been an increase in the articles in JAB that have at least one equation, and now we're up to 30%. So quantitative analyses are becoming more and more widespread. And anyone can do quantitative analyses of behavior, really. You don't have to be a mathematical guru in order to excel at it. No pun intended, but Excel can help. Using a spreadsheet like Excel can help you excel at quantitative analyses. Sorry, I didn't plan that. That just slipped out. And quantitative analyses of behavior is not stats. It has nothing. In fact, it's very different. Okay. And what I'd like to do is offer you a framework, a simple framework for understanding the different types of quantitative analyses that you can do as a researcher. And the first type really boils down to a decision about whether or not an effect is real. And by real, what we mean, is the effect reliable? Is it a replicable effect? Second type of quantitative analysis is developing a model to provide a description of an empirical phenomena. So developing models is a second type of quantitative analysis. And finally, quantitative analyses can involve applying models to data. And it could be a single model or it could be more than one model, in which case you're looking at model comparison. So trying to evaluate of different models applied to the same data, which performs best. So I think really a lot of what we do in terms of quantitative analyses of behavior can be understood in terms of one of these three categories. Now, the first effect is, or rather the first type, is the effect real? For instance, if you're, well, actually here I do have an applied behavior analysis example. Imagine this is a rate of self-injurious behavior, perhaps, and you have a measure of baseline. Then there's an intervention, which is supposed to reduce the rate of the behavior, and then back to baseline. You might say, does the intervention decrease the rate of injurious behavior? And you might just do it by looking at the data, which Michael Davison once pointed out to me is known as the interocular trauma test. If the effect hits you between the eyes, it's real. And so that would probably look pretty good. We'd probably say that was a real effect, especially if we had several different participants in our study and they all showed the same thing. But we can also use inferential statistics to make decisions about whether effects are real. So this is more of what mainstream psychology will do. Like, for instance, in the bottom diagram, if that's a big between group study and we've got standard error bars, we've got to decide if there's a main effect of small versus large reinforcers, perhaps, we could conduct an analysis of variance and perhaps decide that that effect is real. But in either case, whether you choose to use hypothesis testing or just look at the data, you have to rely on informed judgment. You have to take responsibility as a researcher for making sure that you collected the data under appropriate conditions. If you were using inferential statistics, that the assumptions are valid, and so forth. So we can never completely escape from the judgment of the researcher. However, it's not the focus of this talk. I'm not going to say anything more about these kinds of quantitative methods, which have to do with deciding whether or not you've got an effect. So they're not the focus of this talk. What I would like to talk about is a little bit more is developing models and testing models. So models provide an economical summary of the relationship between variables. And I've taken what's perhaps one of the most well-known mathematical models from behavior analysis. That's Herrnstein's hyperbola. It's the relationship between response rate and reinforcement rate on a VI schedule. And the equation is over on the left, but basically the pattern that Herrnstein's model describes is that response rate under VI schedules increases as reinforcement rate increases, but it eventually reaches an asymptote. So it's an increasing, negatively accelerated function. The value of an equation, and there's the hyperbolic equation over on the left, is that it provides a very concise description of that functional relationship. And it provides two parameters, k and r naught, which can become the focus of research efforts to identify, what determines k, which is the asymptote. Basically, k is the asymptote parameter, and r naught is interpreted as the extraneous rate of reinforcement, which determines how rapidly response rate reaches its maximum value. So that's just an example of a model. But what I thought I'd do for this tutorial is illustrate. Like if you go back, if you're a student and you read Herrnstein's classic 1970 paper on the law of effect, where he talks about that hyperbolic model, you might wonder, where did that come from? How was he such a genius that he was able to come up with that model? So what I thought I would do, I'm not going to try to be like Herrnstein here, but simply I want to take some data from a relatively simple experiment and show you how you can begin to develop a model. So this is something that you can try at home, and not just something that you have to read about. Now, this experiment is actually a very simple experiment. I've got a pigeon, and he's in a standard experimental chamber, and he's going to peck that center key. I don't know if you can see it's lighted green. He's going to peck that key for food reinforcement under VI schedules. In this experiment, in fact, there were different VI schedules that were used in the same session. And what would happen is the key light would come on green, and the pigeon would peck the key, and there'd be some VI schedule that was in effect. Pigeon would earn a number of reinforcers, and then the key would go off, and there'd be an intercomponent interval, would come on green again, and then there'd be a different VI schedule. These VI schedules that were used in the session ranged from CRF, continuous reinforcement, to a very lean schedule, VI 1024. There were 7 of them, and the pigeon was given many sessions of training. And this graph shows the response rate in the VI 1024 second schedule as a function of time since the schedule started. Now remember that the key light would come on green, but there was no differential signal given to the pigeon as to what the reinforcement rate was. So every session when the component would start, it could be a CRF. It could be a very rich schedule. And so what we saw is that the pigeon would respond at a very high rate. He starts off at responding 180 responses per minute. That's his response rate, about 3 times per second. Very, very high response rate. But if it was the VI 1024 second schedule, this was the leanest schedule, then as time elapses, pigeon's not getting any reinforcers, and we can see that response rate goes down. Now, the data in this figure were pooled over the last 50 sessions. So this pigeon had over 100 sessions of exposure to the basic procedure, and these data are aggregated over the last 50 sessions of training. And you can see that there looks to be a nice, clear, functional relationship between response rate and elapsed time in the VI 1024 second schedule. So the question is, how could we model these data? And we'll do this, but because this is a tutorial, I want to give you some background and some basic concepts of model estimation and selection first, which are going to be needed as we go along. Estimation and selection are what statisticians talk about when they talk about developing models. Estimation is applying a quantitative model to data. Sometimes we call it curve fitting. But in technical terms, what a statistician would say is that you're estimating parameter values for a particular model. So say with Herrnstein's equation, you've got response rate under different VI schedules, and you want to find the values of K and R naught in Herrnstein's model which best fit the data. What you're doing is estimating parameters. But selection is when you have different models for the same data, and you have to select which model is better. So estimation and selection are important concepts, terms that statisticians use when talking about models. And to make some of the notions of best fitting model, to make those notions more concrete, I want to consider a simple example using linear regression, which some of you may, if you've already had, or if you remember your statistics course, probably some of what I'll say over the next 5 minutes or so will be very, very familiar. Otherwise, it could be a refresher for those of you that don't remember your stats course. In any case, imagine that we have some data here. These are just made-up data, but I'm presuming that there's a relationship, say, between resistance to extinction and number of reinforcements, and that's just a scatter plot of those two variables. And if we wanted to try and represent the relationship in that scatter plot in terms of a simple model, perhaps the easiest thing that we could do would be to assume that there's a linear relationship between those variables. So what we're doing is basically modeling the increasing correlation, you might say, or the pattern, the fact that as the number of reinforcements goes up, the resistance to extinction seems to be going up. We try to represent that in ideal terms in that straight, or with that straight line. And the linear relationship is defined by two parameters, two parameters, the slope and the intercept. And the slope and intercept of that line are shown y equals 0.97, x minus 0.79. So 0.97 is the slope, and minus 0.79 is the intercept. But what we do, we need to be able to measure how well that linear function, how well that regression line describes the relationship in the data between number of reinforcements and resistance to extinction. And to do that, we have to break down, we have to basically partition the variance in the dependent variable, that is resistance to extinction, into two components. One component that's explained by the regression, which we'll call sum of squares regression, and one component that's not, known as sum of squares error. And basically what we're going to do is take the variance in our data, that's data, and we're going to break it down into SS regression plus SS error. And this is an example of a conceptual framework, data equals model plus error, that underlies all of data analysis. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. Technically, how the partitioning of variance works out is as follows. The equation on the top shows the deviation y minus the mean of y, the difference of the y value, so that's resistance to extinction, minus the mean of resistance to extinction. You can see if you look at the point the point in the lower left-hand corner, imagine that's point Y. So that has, for a value of 3 reinforcements, we had a resistance to extinction of 1. A deviation of that point from the mean resistance to extinction, which is 6, can be broken down into 2 pieces. One piece is a deviation of the predicted value, which I'm writing as Y prime. The predicted value that is the value predicted by the regression line, deviation of that predicted value from the mean value, Y prime minus the mean of Y, plus a deviation of the actual value, Y, minus the predicted value of Y, Y prime. And so you can see that the deviation here can be broken down into these 2 pieces. And when if you calculate those deviations for each of the points, square them and sum them up, you get the sum of squares total, which is essentially the total variance in your data, in 2 components, SS regression plus SS error. So SS regression is the variance in the data that's explained by your model, and SS error is the variance that's left unexplained. Now, the way linear regression works is by finding the parameters of the regression line, the slope and intercept, such that the sum of squared error, that is the sum of the squared deviations of the obtained values from the predicted values, in other words, the little green lines in that figure, that sum of squared error is minimized. So we say that that regression line is the best fitting regression line because it's minimized the sum of the squared deviations. And this method of parameter estimation is called least squares estimation because we're minimizing the sum of squared deviations. It's mathematically optimal in the sense that the goodness of fit of the regression line to the data is maximized. And we measure the goodness of fit as the proportion of variance accounted for, or VAC. And that's just the sum of squares regression divided by the sum of squares total. So it's how much variance does the regression line, does the model account for as a proportion of the total variance. That's the goodness of fit. And that can vary up to a maximum of 100%. So if if all the points fall exactly on the line, then the sum of squared regression is equal to sum of squared total, and the model accounts for all of the variance in the data, which would mean that the model is perfect. Of course, typically, the variance accounted for is less than perfect. In this example, it turns out that the linear regression accounts for 77% of the variance. Now, in regression, there is the statisticians have worked out all the maths, and there's actually a closed form solution for the slope and intercept, which minimize the sum of squared errors. But you can obtain parameters for arbitrary functions that maximize the goodness of fit of a function by using a technique known as nonlinear optimization. Basically, you use a computer program that does all the hard work of searching all the possible parameter values and find those values that maximize the variance accounted for by your model. So we can work with any kind of model. It doesn't have to be linear. This technique is called curve fitting. I'd like to illustrate the use of curve fitting for the example data that I just showed you a few moments ago. So now let's get back to our data. So here are the data that we'd like to model. And this is, as I said earlier, the response rate for the VI 1024 schedule as a function of time since the schedule began in the session. And we like to find a simple mathematical function that can describe these data. Now, we might begin just by observing what are the qualities that function should have. Well, it's obviously a decreasing function. Response rate is decreasing. It looks like a curve, and it seems to reach an asymptote in the sense that it sort of reaches the minimum value and then pretty much stays there. So we want to find a mathematical function that has those qualities. Such a function would be a good candidate for a model for these data. And 2 off-the-shelf functions that possess those qualities, they're decreasing, curved, and reach an asymptote, are the exponential function and the hyperbolic function. Now, these functions, I've shown the equations for the exponential and the hyperbolic, and then I've graphed them down below. You do have to know a little bit of math. I guess I don't want to lie. You have to know a little bit of math, but it's not that much. Knowing, you really can go a long way with just being familiar with a few simple functions, such as the exponential and the hyperbolic. So anyway, both of these functions are decreasing, curved, and reach an asymptote. And it might be interesting to see if one or other of these functions does a better job of describing the data from our experiment. Now, right at the outset, we maybe have a bit of a problem because the data from our pigeon vary from 180 responses per minute down to about 40 responses per minute. But we can solve this problem by rescaling those data so that they basically are on a standard scale, so that they vary from 1 to 0. And this is a technique known as normalizing. We take our data, whatever the range is, we're going to put it on a common scale from 1 to 0. And the way we do that is by assuming that basically by making the maximum response rate 1 and the asymptotic response rate 0. And the equation that you have to use is given here. That what we do is take the response rate and calculate the difference between the response rate and the asymptotic response rate, and divide that by the difference between the maximum response rate and the asymptotic response rate. And basically that means that when the response rate is equal to the maximum response rate, then the normalized data is R max minus R asymptote divided by R max minus R asymptote, which is 1. But when response rate reaches the asymptote, then it's 0, because R asymptote minus R asymptote is 0 divided by R max minus R asymptote. So essentially what we can do is no matter what the maximum and asymptotic response rates are, we can put them on a common scale from 1 to 0. And this makes it very easy now to apply the exponential and the hyperbolic models, because both of those functions, in the simple form that we're looking at, both of those functions simply vary essentially from 1 to 0. So we've got our functions and we've got our data. Now what we need to do is find the parameter values in the exponential and hyperbolic model that maximize the variance accounted for in our data. So for the exponential model, you can see the equation y equals e to the minus q times t. T is time, y is the response rate, q is the parameter. That's a parameter that says how rapidly, how fast the exponential function falls off. If q is large, it means it decreases very rapidly. If q is small, it decreases more slowly. So q is the parameter in the exponential model. For the hyperbolic model, the equation is y, response rate is equal to 1, or rather I should say normalized response rate, is equal to 1 minus 1 plus k times t. So here, again, t is time, and k now is the rate parameter. If k is very small, then the hyperbolic drops off more rapidly. If k is very large, then it drops off more slowly. So what I'd like to do now is illustrate how you can carry out parameter estimation using nonlinear optimization in Excel. So basically what I'm going to do, show you how to fit these curves to our data. Now I'm going to need to switch to Microsoft Excel, and I've got a spreadsheet, and let me show you what's in the spreadsheet. I've got two columns over here. This column that says bin, this is basically the time that's elapsed in the VI 1024 component. This is the response rate. So these are actually our data. So bin is the time and rate is the response rate. I've calculated the maximum value up here is 179.52, about 180 responses per minute, and the asymptote is just under 40, about 38.5 responses per minute. And that I just calculated is the average over the last 40 time bins in the sessions. Then in column E, I've calculated the normalized data using the formula that I showed before. Now, rather than go through exactly how all of the mechanics of Excel work, what I suggest you do, if you're interested in in working with these data yourself, this file is posted on the SQAB website, so you can download it and you can look at the equations and see exactly how it works. Because this is something where you really need to get your hands dirty with data. It helps a lot. This column shows, again, our normalized data. So this is really what we want to fit. If I look over here at the data, this is our figure, and you can see that I've selected the chart. Now we can see that we're just displaying the normalized data. Now column F, this has the predictions of the exponential model. And you notice the function up here, exp to the minus q times a4. Minus q, of course, q is the rate parameter, and that's up here. And I've named that cell. And that's the cell. I need to find the value of q that gives me the best fit. Now I've got another figure down here that shows the fit of the exponential model. And the predicted values are shown in magenta. The blue values are the data. And you can see, I mean, it's not fitting very well. So we have to find the value of q that will basically make that the predicted values shown in magenta have the best correspondence with the actual data. Now I'd like to show you one other cell up here. This is it says VACEXP. This is the variance accounted for by the exponential model. And this is using the formula for variance accounted for, sum of squares regression divided by sum of squares total. Now, to actually perform the curve fitting, Excel has a routine known as solver, which is a nonlinear optimization routine. You can get it. It's actually an add-in for Excel. So if it's not installed in your version of Excel, you can select add-ins and you just tick the solver option. But I've already got mine installed. So you go to the Tools menu and then you see Solver. And in Solver, what you do is you specify a target cell. So that's the cell that we're going to want to change. And what I want to do is take the variance accounted for cell, and I want to set that equal to, I want Solver to find its maximum value by changing the cell with the Q value. So I want Solver to change Q, to find the value of Q, such that the variance accounted for by the exponential is maximized. So that's really all I need to do. Now, if I had a more complicated model with more than one parameter, I would just add the parameters here, each delimited by a comma. Solver can handle as many parameters as you want. So I just click Solve, and Solver has converged to the current solution, so everything looks happy. And now notice that the variance accounted for is increased about just under 75%. And here's the fit of the exponential model. So that's better than before. Is it a very good fit? Well, one thing that you might notice is that the predictions of the exponential model tend to be greater than the obtained values for small values of the x variable time, but then the predicted values go beneath. And so we would say that the errors that the exponential model seems to be making are systematic. It's not capturing the exact nature of the curvature in the data. And one way to see that very directly is to plot the errors as a function of time. And here I've plotted the errors, and you can see that they go negative, and then they go positive, and stay positive for a while, and then sort of go around zero. If the exponential model is a true model, then the errors should be random. You remember the equation that I mentioned earlier, data equals model plus error. If the model has captured all of the structure in the data, then the errors that you obtain when you subtract the model's predictions from the data should be completely random. These errors don't look random. So I'm going to guess, even though I know the answer, I'm going to guess that the exponential model is not the correct model for these data. But let's go on and have a look at the hyperbolic model. Now this is exactly the same as the other spreadsheet, except that instead of the predictions of the exponential model, we have the hyperbolic model here in this column F. And here's the K parameter, here's the fit of the hyperbolic model, and it doesn't look very good yet, but we haven't run solver. So we have to now find the value of K such that the variance accounted for by the hyperbolic model is maximized. So I'm going to run solver again, tools, solver, and looks like it's all set up, so it's going to maximize variance accounted for by changing cell K, and I click solve, and solver has converged to the current solution, and aha, we're doing much better now, 91.7% of the variance. So that's substantially more than the 75% accounted for by the exponential model, and you can see that the fit of the line, that is the fit of the predicted values of the hyperbola, this curved function looks like it's in much better correspondence with the data. But if we have a look at the residuals of the hyperbolic model, you can see that there still may be a pattern of systematic deviation here. Even though it's doing much better than the exponential model in terms of describing the data, in terms of variance accounted for, there may still be some structure in the data that the hyperbolic model is failing to capture. So if we were going to work further with this example, we might consider ways in which we could modify the simple hyperbolic function so that it might be able to pick up some of this systematic error. And so that's what you do when you develop a model. You start with your data, you develop a model, you see how well it fits, you examine the errors, and if you find something systematic in the errors, you then go and try to revise the model. So it's a kind of iterative process of developing a model. Now, how much time do I have? About 20 minutes. Oh, very good. That's good. So let me go back to so we found that the best fitting exponential model accounts for about 75% of the variance. Best fitting hyperbolic model accounts for 92% of the variance. So of these two models, if we're choosing between these models, doing model selection, we would say that the hyperbolic model provides a better description, which is interesting. Maybe that's a good result, given that Herrnstein's response rate model uses a hyperbolic function. We find that a hyperbolic function provides a better description of the data than the exponential here. I don't have an answer to that for you, but it's very interesting. These are unpublished data, just from an experiment that I did a number of years ago. Okay, the hyperbolic function seems to provide the better model for our data, and this example has illustrated a number of things. Simply that we can identify functional relationships observed in data, the technique of fitting different quantitative models to data, choosing between models, in other words, picking out the model that does a better job of accounting for the variance in the data, and the importance of looking at errors in prediction. A lot of times, researchers will fit a model to data, and if they get 90% of the variance accounted for, they say, hooray, I've got a model that's doing great. But it's always a good idea to look at the residuals, to look at the errors, and see if there's anything that the model is failing to capture. And so, really, one of the take-home messages from this whole presentation is that the equation data equals model plus error, in a sense, this is the fundamental equation of data analysis, certainly the fundamental equation of modeling. We've got data, and if we have a phenomenon, if we have an effect, if there's something, if there's a functional relationship, there's something in our data, we want to express that in a model. And when we subtract the model's predictions from the data and we look at the error, if the model is capturing all of the structure in the data, then the error should just be random. So you need to look at the residuals. The residuals of the error is just the data minus the model, and they should be random. And systematic residuals indicates that there's structure that's not captured by the model. Now, residuals can also be used for model comparison. And what I'd like to do now, in the time remaining, is illustrate how we can make some very fine comparisons between models. And in particular, I'm going to look at the generalized matching law, which is well known as an account of response allocation, that is choice, under concurrent VI-VI schedules. That was proposed by Baum back in 1974. And a model that came out later, known as the contingency discriminability model, by Davison and Jenkins, 1985. Now, I'm not going to worry about the equations here. If you're interested in these models or in concurrent schedules, there's a very large literature. It's very, very interesting. But what I'd like to point out, and this was noted, in fact, by Davison and Jenkins when they proposed the contingency discriminability model, these two models, the contingency discriminability model is able to mimic the predictions of the generalized matching law very closely. The generalized matching law is a linear function, a straight line, if you plot the log response ratio on the y-axis and the log reinforcer ratio on the x-axis. And what I've done in these two figures is, on the left, use the generalized matching law to generate data. So those blue data points are perfectly linear. I then fitted the contingency discriminability model. I found, by using Excel Solver, just as we did with the response rate example, I found the value of the parameter in the contingency discriminability model that maximized the variance accounted for. And then in the right-hand panel, I turned the tables. I used the contingency discriminability model to generate the data. So the blue data points are calculated from the contingency discriminability model, and I fitted the generalized matching law. And as you can see, the predictions of the two models, as shown by the pink lines, are very close. And in fact, each model is accounting for well over 99% of the variance in the data generated by the other model. In other words, these models, these predictions are almost right on top of each other. And that means that simply fitting these models, like taking a data set and fitting the GML, the matching law, and the contingency discriminability model to the same data, it won't work because the models will account for very similar proportions of variance. But what I'd like to do is illustrate for you how analysis of residuals can be very informative. And this is taking after an analysis that Baum, Schwendemann, and Bell published in a 1999 article in JAB. They noted that if the generalized matching law is the true model, and that's basically what I did on the previous slide, if I can back up here for a moment. If the generalized matching law is the true model, that's the left panel. I've fitted the contingency discriminability model. It may look like it's exactly on top, but there is actually a very subtle pattern of deviation. In fact, if we plot the residuals, they look like that. The residuals for the contingency discriminability model, when fitted to data that are generated by the generalized matching law, make that kind of a pattern, sort of a squiggle. But on the other hand, if the contingency discriminability model is the true model, we fit the generalized matching law, residuals make a different kind of pattern, kind of an opposite squiggle. Now, actually, we don't have to call that a squiggle. In fact, it's what we would call a cubic function, and to analyze, to make a comparison between these models, I'm going to use a technique known as polynomial regression, where what we're going to do is, if you remember that a polynomial function in x, for y equals b0 plus b1 times x. Now, if we stop right there, you have a linear function because you've got b0 and b1, an intercept and a slope. And on the two left panels, I show a positive linear relation and a negative linear relation, depending on whether the value of b1 is positive or negative. But if we add b2 times x squared, so we add a term for x squared, then you get what's known as a quadratic function. And if b2 is positive, you get a positive quadratic, you get a U shape. If it's negative, you get an inverted U shape. If we go on and add b3 times x cubed, we add a term for x cubed, then we get what's known as a cubic function, and we get something that looks like the squiggle. In fact, with a positive cubic coefficient, b3, you get a squiggle that looks like the residuals for what the contingency discriminability model residuals should look like if the generalized matching law is true. And with a negative cubic coefficient, you get a squiggle that looks a little bit like what the residuals for the generalized matching law should look like if the contingency discriminability model is true. So we illustrate positive linear and negative linear functions, positive quadratic and negative quadratic functions, and positive cubic and negative cubic. So if the generalized matching law is the true model, the contingency discriminability model residuals should have a positive cubic component. But on the other hand, if the contingency discriminability model is true, then generalized matching law residuals should have a negative cubic component. So whether or not the residuals fall into one or other of those patterns is essentially a critical test of these two models. But the problem is that if we examine for this kind of pattern in any single data set, because of the variability in the data, we don't have enough statistical power in order to detect that pattern. These patterns are very, very subtle. But that doesn't mean that we can't answer the question, because one of the great things about our field is that we collect data. We've got lots and lots of data. And so there is a technique that we can use by analyzing the residuals from many studies to give us basically more statistical power in order to test whether or not we get those patterns predicted by the generalized matching law and contingency discriminability model. And so what I'd like to do is illustrate this. This is from a project that a master's student, Nick Sutton, at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand is working on. We took data from 10 archival studies and fitted generalized matching law and contingency discriminability model to the data from these studies. And in total, we had 613 data points. So we have quite a lot of data points. And the models accounted for very similar proportions of variance, 95% for the generalized matching law and 94% for the contingency discriminability model. So both models are performing really well. So we might think it's going to be very difficult to discriminate between these models just simply in terms of their variance accounted for. But we wanted to look at the residuals. And so what we did was pool the residuals across studies for both models, and then we conducted a polynomial regression in which we basically fitted a regression model including linear, quadratic, and cubic coefficients to the residuals as a function of the predicted values. And this shows the resulting cubic polynomial for the residuals of the contingency discriminability model. And in fact, the cubic component was statistically significant. Now, I said earlier I wasn't going to talk about stats very much, but what we found when we did the regression was that red squiggle basically is accounting for 3% of the variance in the residuals, but that is statistically greater than 0. So there is a statistically significant positive cubic component in those residuals, which is just what you would predict if the generalized matching law is correct. So this is looking pretty good for the generalized matching law. We've got exactly the pattern that it would predict. On the other hand, when we look at the residuals of the generalized matching law, the contingency discriminability model would predict that we have a negative cubic coefficient, but in fact, there was no significant. The cubic component was not statistically significant, and it only accounted for, in total, 1% of the variance, which was not greater than 0. So the results of this small-scale study, I'm not claiming that the generalized matching law is necessarily going to win if we continue to look at more data sets. I simply wanted to illustrate that you can make some very fine distinctions between models that can mimic each other's predictions very closely by carefully examining residuals and seeing if the patterns predicted by one model are found in the residuals of a competing model. So, positive cubic component for the contingency discriminability residuals suggests the GML is a better model for choice. It illustrates how fine distinctions can be made between quantitative models. And so, really, I guess, just to conclude, the take-home messages from this tutorial are that there really are different types of quantitative analyses. One is the effect real? Do you have a real effect in your data? And this is one of the most common questions that we face. Many behavior analysts will do, you'll do a multiple baseline design and then look at the data from the individuals and use an interocular trauma test, perhaps. Just examine the data, and that's fine. You can make an informed judgment as to whether or not you have an effect. If you're so inclined, you can calculate a null hypothesis test. You can use inferential statistics to decide whether or not you've got a real effect. So that's one large class of analyses. A second class is trying to develop models to describe phenomena. And this is a lot of what we do. Developing models is hard. I mean, Herrnstein, when he came up with the quantitative law of effect, there was a lot of creativity behind that. And I guess a message from this tutorial is that we have a lot of advantages over Herrnstein now. We've got computers. We've got spreadsheets like Excel. We've got tools like Solver. And armed with just a little bit of knowledge about some basic mathematical functions like an exponential function or a hyperbolic function, you can go a long way towards describing the functional relationships in data. Of course, before you apply the equations, what you want to do is simply look at your data, make a graph, identify in words what the relationship seems to be. And once you've identified it in words, you can go from there to try and apply maybe some of the equations, like an exponential equation or a hyperbolic equation. And the analyses that I've done here are really at a descriptive level. I'm not presenting a theory, and that's a further step. Developing a model. Models describe phenomena, and then if you integrate models into an explanatory theory, that's a further step. And I'm not dealing with that today. I'm talking about the mechanics of how you work with some of these basic equations, how you apply them to data, and how you choose between different models for the same data. So there's a lot of technical aspects to doing that. And I guess part of what I wanted to sort of get across is that it's not as hard. It's a little difficult. You have to make a little bit of an effort, but it's really not that hard, and the payoff is well worth it. Data is model plus error. I repeat this over and over again. because it's so important, that what we do is identify phenomena in our data, functional relationships. We model them, and then we look at the errors. And we, if there's something systematic in the errors, then we should be encouraged to change our model. But in general, quantitative analyses are important for behavioral science because our measurements are meaningful. We know to look at behavior and not just potentially dubious self-report scales. And quantitative analyses are much easier than you think, or maybe hopefully I've been able to convince you that they're not so hard. So maybe it's much easier than you thought before you began to listen to me. That would be good. And last but not least, the Excel file for the model fitting example is available on the SQAB website, and I would encourage you to download it and have a play. And if anybody has any questions, you can send me an email, randolph.grace@canterbury.ac.nz. So thank you.
Before you leave, I would like to ask you to fill out a little survey that helps us keep track of our PDC.
I don't know if we have any time for questions, or if anybody has any questions, or would.
Give the
Yeah.
email again.
Sorry?
Would you give the email address?
Yeah, it's Randolph.grace, just my name, Randolph.grace, at Canterbury, CANTERBURY, .ac.nz. NZ, yeah. Canterbury, yeah, Randolph.grace at canterbury.ac.nz. Yeah, Terry.
Is this stuff in courses and textbooks, and if so, can you recommend a textbook?
That's a very good question. Not really. I can't recommend a good textbook where you'd find the kind of information that I was presenting. You can find some of it. Good textbooks on sort of an advanced textbook on regression or applied methods in regression usually will have a good discussion of residual analysis, but they won't deal with nonlinear models. I can't. Jack Maar and others have been talking about the need to try and get together some kind of a textbook for behavior analysis, or textbook for quantitative analysis of behavior, and there really isn't a good textbook, but I think that there's a need for one.
Is this the need for these techniques is exclusive to behavior analysis or quantitative behavior analysis? It's not another discipline?
Well, it's probably in disciplines like biology or behavioral ecology, zoology, certainly in the physical sciences, where you're dealing with a lot of quantitative data. I mean, these methods are very well known. In psychology, no, because most research in mainstream psychology is generally using a hypothesis testing approach. And so they're not going to talk about modeling at all. If they use modeling now, they'll use structural equations modeling. Structural equations modeling, the same issues, in terms of model selection and stuff, those are all present, but the software packages like AMOS and EQS for doing structural equation modeling, the user is insulated from a lot of these issues. And you're also restricted in terms of like those structural equations models are generally linear. No, I mean in mainstream psychology they don't have the same type of data that we have. I mean, I go back to structural equation modeling. They're modeling the variance covariance matrix in those studies, which Whereas we're talking about behavior, we've got real response rates, real reinforcer rates. So no, in fact, most of the time in other areas, certainly other areas of psychology, they don't have to deal with these same issues. Yeah, Jade.
Well, I know a lot of advanced mathematics is used in a lot of different fields, physics and chemistry. I was just wondering, do you see the quantitative analysis of behavior moving towards more advanced or esoteric mathematics, more calculus, trigonometry, calculus? Where do you see that going?
Where to see the use of advanced mathematics in the quantitative analysis of behavior? That's a good question. I think that I think it's actually better to have your model, if you're trying to develop a model or a theory, to try and have it be as simple as possible. You don't want it to be so simple that it fails to capture the phenomena. But I would avoid using a really complex analysis just because it looks exciting. I mean, having been there myself, okay, this is like a true confession time. I was interested in nonlinear modeling and chaos theory and those types of approaches, and they can be very appealing on the surface. It's kind of fun. You're cool. You're using these advanced equations and stuff. But if it's not necessary, if it's too complex for the phenomena that you're trying to model, and really what I was trying to show here is just simple functional relationships that we can observe between behavior and environmental variables. And using a more complex model is warranted if you can show that the simpler model is wrong. In terms of what kinds of math students could benefit from, certainly if you have a calculus course, if you have a course in probability or stochastic processes, that's very important. Those kinds of stochastic Poisson processes, or that kind of math is widely used in quantitative analysis of behavior. I haven't talked about that very much, but that's very, very common. That as our field matures and there's an increasing literature on both sides that you have to assimilate, to be able to complete a PhD or a master's, it becomes a harder and harder task essentially to try and keep up. But I think that quantitative analyses are relevant if basic research is going to move beyond simple verbal descriptions or theories that are stated only in verbal terms. And I would probably point to the work of, say, someone like Jack McDowell as kind of an exemplar of someone who can bridge basic and applied research by looking at how, in fact, Jack has taken Herrnstein's equation, the model that I was talking about in the beginning of my talk, a very widely used model. He's taken that and applied it to settings, basically looking at human data with clients. I think it was like a self-injurious behavior. It was McDowell, I think 1991 might have been the citation. I can find it for you in any case, but he's a very good example. One thing that we'll be doing, that SQAB will be doing, is trying to work with applied researchers and trying to facilitate some model development. Working with researchers that might have some data or might have a problem which could be amenable to a quantitative analysis. This is probably going to be a symposium in ABA either next year or the year after. So, yeah, I think we need to try and keep our field together and not have the basic and applied people go too far off. But the thing is that once you get quantitative data, once you can measure phenomena systematically, it's a natural step to try and describe the functional relations economically in terms of models. And once you do that, if you use hyperbolic discounting or a hyperbolic response rate function, or maybe use a power function, you need to be able to use the tools that I've been trying to illustrate. But it's a very good question. Yeah.
Please correct me if I'm wrong, but this might be a little bit more technical. Is there any way you could bring up the graph on the very first graph that you showed us with the errors?
Yep, sure. The first graph with this graph, or okay. Sorry. Which one was it? Was it with the residuals of the model fit?
Yeah.
Okay, that might have been in the Excel file.
Oh, maybe that's what it was. I was wondering, you see a pattern still within the residuals. I was wondering, it seems to me that you're only accounting for one variable in the hyperbolic function that would produce that fit. Is there any way to account for more than one variable? I mean, in our, in a functional analysis, for example, it may show you that you have more than one function of behavior. And if you have two functions of behavior, that's more than one variable that might be creating the data pattern.
Okay.
If you have that underlying pattern, maybe that's why there's a pattern in residuals. And I was just wondering if there's any way to...
That's true. Well, there are a couple ways that I can answer your question. One would be, okay, here we've got a hyperbolic model that's doing a reasonably good job. I mean, as a first approximation, about 92% of the variance. That's pretty good. But when we look at the residuals, and I'm having a little trouble with the mouse, but there does seem to be something systematic in the residuals. So if we wanted to add an extra parameter, this is just, we're only using a single parameter. We could make the hyperbolic model more complicated. I mean, a simple way would be perhaps to, instead of using time, maybe we could use an exponent of time. Like, for instance, we could raise the time variable to an exponent. Call it A. And I could change the equation, and I could see, in fact, I mean, I could do it for you probably right now. I could do it in 1 second. I'm going to make a new cell, call it A1, and I go up here and I say insert name define, and name A1 refers to that cell. I say add, and then in the predictions of the hyperbolic model, now what I'm going to do is say k times A4, and I'm going to raise it to the A1 exponent. So I've just added a parameter, and now I paste it all the way down, and now I can go to solver, back to solver, and say, okay, maximize variance accounted for by changing k and A1. And we don't improve very much at all. Notice that the variance accounted for has only gone up just a tiny bit. The value of A is very close to 1. So the best fitting value of A is 0.985. We haven't been able to fix it at all. We still have the same pattern of residuals. I mean, this is actually very, very interesting in a way, because it says that it's a function of time. It's not a function of the square root of time or any other exponent of time. It's time. Now, there are other ways, perhaps, that you could change that function, add another parameter, and be able to fix the systematic pattern. But yeah, but you had a second point, which was that what if there's another variable on which behavior depends? And the only variables that the only data that I'm looking at here, I've got time elapsed in the component and response rate. Now, if I had a third variable, I'm not sure what that variable would be here. It could be the history of responding, or how many reinforcers were obtained in this component on the previous day. Those variables could be added. You would just have them in a second column here, and then you would include them in the model. You would have to change the model. You would be coming up with a different model that would, instead of being just a function of time, it would be a function of time and that other variable. And you would have to have a model that made sense, that somehow combined the effects of time and this other variable.
By model, you mean equation, right?
Yeah. So I guess those are the two ways that you could make the model more complex. You could add parameters to make it a more complex hyperbolic function of time. Time is still just one variable. Or you could add other variables, like perhaps the deprivation level of the pigeon. How many reinforcers had been obtained up to that point in the session? What was the pigeon's body weight prior to that session? I mean, these are all other variables that could be included in your model.
When you say that you're adding the variables, are you now producing a three-dimensional and four-dimensional graph as well? Or is all of that included in the two-dimensional equation?
Well, you wouldn't necessarily have to include, you could make a three-dimensional graph. It would be hard to make a four-dimensional graph. But the other thing that you could do, even if you had other variables, you could still plot the predicted values as a function of one of the variables. And maybe you could make one plot for each of the variables. I mean, that would only be giving you a slice of the function of the total functional relationship, but then you would still be getting an accurate display of how the dependent variable, how responding, varied as a function of that variable. It would be harder to make a visual display of that relationship. It starts depending on more than one variable. For that reason, a lot of times people will, if you've got more than one variable on which your dependent variable depends, the easiest type of model to work with is a linear model. And so going from linear regression to multiple, from simple linear regression where you've got x and y, if you've got x1 and x2, you've got two predictor variables but still one outcome or dependent variable y. That's a very easy model to work with because you just add x1 times its coefficient plus x2 times its coefficient. That's a simple model to work with. But if you have a nonlinear model and you start adding other variables, it could get very complex. But sort of go back to an earlier point I made that it's always a good idea to start simple. Look at the just look at your data. Make graphs, make figures of your data, make scatter plots, and try and describe the functional relationship verbally. Recognize that pattern. That's the first step, is recognizing that you have a functional relationship. And once you see that pattern, once you see the effect, that pattern in your data, then you can try to develop a model which gives you a more compact, economical summary of that pattern. And if it starts to be a pattern that we find over and over again, like, for example, hyperbolic discounting. I mean, that's a process which can be used to explain all sorts of different, humans responding in self-control choices and so forth. That becomes a very useful model because it's able to give us a parsimonious, a simple account of lots of different phenomena.